floor plates. I had grown accustomed to it over the months, but tonight it felt heavier, more charged, as if the station itself was holding its breath. We were about to make history. I stood in the research deck, surrounded by towering machines, their monitors flickering with streams of complex data. Superconducting coils encased the Einstein-Rosen device, a massive, ring-shaped construct that pulsed with the barely contained energy of our most ambitious experiment yet, the artificial creation of a stable wormhole. Dr. Varensky paced beside me, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes flicking to the displays with sharp, hawk-like intensity. His presence was like a tightly coiled spring, radiating nervous energy despite the outward calm he tried to maintain. "Final system check," he said, his voice clipped. I tapped through the diagnostics, my fingers moving over the interface with precision. Singularity chamber stable. Magnetic field containment optimal. No anomalies detected. Dr. Melendez, stationed at the opposite console, adjusted the reactor output. Power levels are nominal. We're good to proceed. The rest of the team, 7 of us in total, stood at their respective stations, each playing a critical role. Months of preparation had led to this moment. I glanced at the observation window, which overlooked the core of the experiment, the center of the Einstein-Rosen device, where space itself would soon fold inward. Varensky exhaled sharply. "Then let's begin." A countdown appeared on the monitors. T-minus 60 seconds. The energy coils began to charge, their rhythmic pulses growing stronger. The containment field shimmered, casting eerie, shifting patterns along the metallic walls. The air inside the research deck became heavier, an almost imperceptible pressure building within my skull. 30 seconds. The station creaked. An unnatural distortion rippled through the chamber, a visual warping as if reality itself had become a stretched rubber sheet. It was expected, but still it sent a chill down my spine. 10 seconds. I glanced at Varensky. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his hands gripping the console tighter than before. 5. A deep, resonant hum filled the station. 4. The flickering distortion in the air solidified into something darker, denser. 3. A sudden metallic groan, deeper than before. The entire station vibrated. 2. The monitors glitched, random symbols and unreadable data replacing the carefully calibrated numbers. 1. Then silence. A perfect obsidian black sphere materialized within the singularity chamber, hovering motionless at the center of the device. It was small at first, no larger than a marble, but it grew. The energy readings spiked, the containment field wavered. "Power levels exceeding projected output," Melendez said sharply. Her fingers danced over the controls. "We need to stabilize." A warning klaxon shrieked through the station. Then the singularity lurched. It expanded. Fast. Too fast. The station screamed around us. The observation window fractured, spiderweb cracks racing across its reinforced surface. The lights flickered violently, plunging the deck into rhythmic darkness. And in those flashes, those brief, stuttering moments of black and white, I saw it. Something inside the singularity. A shape. A movement. Not empty space, not a tunnel of compressed gravity. Something was on the other side. The emergency locks failed. The containment field collapsed. The last thing I remembered was the sensation of being pulled. Not just my body, but something deeper. Like reality itself was unraveling around me. Then, darkness. I woke up choking. My lungs burned as if I had been holding my breath for hours, and my body ached with a deep, marrow-deep exhaustion. The sensation of weightlessness told me I was still on Hawking 3, but something was wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. I pushed myself up from the cold metal floor, my fingers slipping against something wet. The research deck was dark, illuminated only by the emergency lights flickering a dim, nauseating green. The usual hum of the station, ventilation systems, power cycling, distant machinery, was absent. A terrible silence had settled over everything. I blinked, my vision adjusting. The walls were different. The smooth metal panels were warped, bulging slightly, as if something underneath was pressing outward. A thin, organic sheen coated their surfaces, catching the sickly green light. Then I saw the blood. Dark smears streaked across the floor, splattered in long, uneven trails. Pieces of fabric, fragments of a lab coat, were tangled in the mess. I swallowed hard. Verensky? Melendez? My voice sounded too loud, too alone. No answer. I forced myself to move, every muscle stiff and sluggish. My mind raced through possible explanations. The wormhole experiment had failed, clearly. But had we suffered some kind of gravitational distortion? Had the station undergone structural damage? Where was the rest of the crew? I staggered towards the nearest console, hoping to access the logs. The screen was cracked, but it flickered to life at my touch. The interface was corrupted, strings of gibberish replacing standard system readouts. Then, through the distortion, I saw one clear line of text. Error. Environmental parameters unknown. Unknown? That didn't make sense. The station's systems were designed to recalibrate automatically if we experienced anomalies. But the meaning was clear. Hawking 3 didn't recognize where it was. A deep, low groan echoed through the corridors, a sound that wasn't mechanical. It was organic, wet. My blood turned to ice. I turned toward the observation window, the one overlooking the singularity chamber. My stomach clenched at what I saw. The wormhole was gone. In its place was an expanse of nothing. Not space, not darkness, just an absence, as if a piece of reality had been cut away. The chamber itself was warped, its structure twisted and fused with something that pulsed and breathed. Then I noticed movement. A figure stood in the hallway beyond the glass. Dr. Verensky. Relief flooded through me, until he moved. His motions were wrong. His arms hung limply at his sides, swinging as he took slow, jerking steps forward. His head lolled slightly, tilting too far to the right as if his neck had lost structural integrity. His lab coat was torn, hanging in ragged strips. Then he looked at me. Or it did. What had once been Dr. Verensky had no eyes anymore. Only empty sockets, black and glistening with something wet. His mouth, stretched impossibly wide, hung open in a permanent, silent scream. The skin along his jaw was splitting, peeling back as if something underneath was trying to push through. I stumbled back. Verensky. His body convulsed. Then he let out a sound, a gurgling, choked wail. It wasn't human. It was something trying to be human. Then he moved, fast, lurching toward the glass. His arms slammed against it, his fingers stretching, warping, the bones bending into too many joints. He wasn't alone. Shadows writhed behind him, shapes shifting in the dim light. The glass cracked. I ran. I sprinted into the corridor, my breath ragged, my mind screaming at me to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. My feet pounded against the floor, which no longer felt entirely solid, like something underneath was shifting, stretching, reacting to my movement. I turned a corner and nearly collapsed in horror. The hallway ahead was wrong. The walls weren't just pulsing now, they had opened. Fleshy, gaping orifices lined the corridor, twitching as I approached. Vein-like tendrils coiled along the ceiling, dripping a thick, viscous fluid onto the floor. The lights flickered in uneven intervals, revealing glimpses of something shifting inside the walls, like an organism half-formed, waiting. A guttural clicking sound echoed from behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I forced myself forward, stepping over broken consoles, cables tangled with sinewy growths. The layout of the station was still familiar, but the environment had changed, mutated. My mind grasped for logic, for any rational explanation, but there was none. I had survived the wormhole collapse, but I wasn't in the same place anymore. This wasn't Hawking 3. Not really. I had crossed into somewhere else, and I wasn't alone. I ran until my lungs burned. My legs felt sluggish, like I was wading through something thick and unseen. The station groaned around me, the walls shifting in slow, undulating movements. It wasn't just metal anymore. Hawking 3 was changing, becoming something else. I reached the command center, slamming the door shut behind me. My fingers fumbled over the control panel, engaging the manual lockdown. The reinforced metal hissed as it sealed, locking me inside. I turned, my breath ragged. The room looked normal at first. The primary consoles still glowed with their dim emergency lights, the interface screens cycling through distorted error messages. But as I stepped forward, my foot squelched against the floor. I looked down. A dark, organic sheen coated the surface, like a film of mucus or something worse. Thin tendrils had begun creeping up the walls, pulsing rhythmically, their color shifting between deep reds and sickly grays. The transformation was spreading here too. I swallowed back a wave of nausea and forced myself toward the main terminal. My hands trembled as I keyed in the emergency logs. The screen flickered violently, static crackling in uneven bursts. Then, through the distortion, text began to appear. Log entry, Dr. Melendez. Something's wrong. The wormhole, it wasn't just a failure. It was a wound. We didn't just open a path. We let something in. The timestamp was recent, minutes ago. My pulse pounded. I scrolled down. Log entry, Dr. Varensky. The station is changing. It's not mechanical anymore. It's something else, something alive, and it's spreading. I clenched my teeth. The last entry was written in uneven, desperate keystrokes. Run. Don't let it take you. Don't... The log cut off. A sound, a wet, dragging noise came from the hallway outside. I froze. Through the reinforced window of the command center door, a shadow moved. A figure hunched and twitching, its body jerking with unnatural spasms. Its arms hung too long at its sides, the fingers stretching, splitting at the tips into writhing, root-like tendrils. Then the face turned toward the window, or what used to be a face. It was Melendez, or what was left of her. Her skin was sloughing off in patches, revealing something darker, slick with fluids. Her mouth had stretched into a gaping, pulsing slit, the lower jaw unhinged like a snake's. Where her eyes had been, there were now holes, deep, empty voids that leaked a thick, black ichor. She twitched violently. Then she screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was a wet, gurgling shriek that echoed through the command center like nails scraping against bone. And then she lunged, slamming her deformed hands against the reinforced glass. The impact sent tremors through the door. Her fingers spread, tendrils slithering from beneath the skin, pressing into the cracks, searching for a way inside. I stumbled back, heart hammering. Something was inside her, something using her. The realization hit me like ice. This wasn't just an infection. It wasn't just mutating them. It was consuming them, replacing them. The transformation was spreading through the station, and if I didn't get out, it would take me too. I turned back to the terminal, scanning for any way to escape. The emergency evacuation protocol had been disabled. Of course, whatever intelligence this thing had, it wasn't letting anyone leave. But the escape pod... My fingers flew over the keys. I bypassed the locked-down systems, rerouting power to the hangar bay. One pod remained intact. It was my only chance. I turned back to the door. Melendez was still there, her body writhing, twisting against the glass. More shapes loomed behind her, half-formed figures, their bodies in various stages of grotesque mutation. They were waiting, watching. I had minutes at best. I reached for the emergency release on the opposite side of the room. As soon as I hit it, the lockdown on the door would lift. I would have to run. I inhaled sharply, steeled myself. Then I hit the release. The door slammed open. Melendez lunged. I ran. The station was dying. Or worse, it was shedding. As I ran, the corridors of Hawking 3 continued to dissolve, the sterile metallic walls sloughing away like dead skin. Beneath them, something raw and living pulsed, a mass of writhing tissue stretching into the darkness. The air reeked of blood and decay, thick with an organic wetness that clung to my skin, seeping into my pores. Behind me, they followed. Not just Melendez anymore. Others. They crawled from the ruined walls, pulling themselves free as if they had been gestating inside the station itself. Some still wore the remnants of their uniforms, but their bodies were no longer their own. Their limbs elongated unnaturally, bones softening, reforming. Some had faces split into vertical gaping mouths. Others had eyes that had melted into their skin, leaving only pulsing sensory pits. They didn't walk. They shuddered forward in spasmodic bursts, propelled by shifting muscle and something else beneath their skins. And they were hungry. I skidded around a corner, nearly falling as my boots slipped against the slick, mucus-like secretion that coated the floors. The escape pod bay was close. I could feel it. A deep, wet clicking echoed behind me. I didn't look back. I reached the final junction and stopped short. The corridor ahead, my only path to the escape pod, was gone. Number not gone. Replaced. The walls had fully transformed, no longer metal, no longer even recognizable. The entire passage was a pulsating tunnel of organic flesh, ridged and breathing. A chasm of blackness loomed at its center, a circular twitching orifice, pulsing with deep, sluggish movements. Thick tendrils stretched from its sides, grasping, their tips lined with small, twitching fingers. A throat, a digestive tract. It wasn't just spreading anymore, it was feeding. The truth slammed into me with the force of a dying star. The station isn't transforming into something alive. The station is being eaten. The horror of the realization threatened to paralyze me, but I had no time to process it, because behind me, they were coming. A wet, unnatural shriek erupted from the corridor. I bolted. The only path left was through it. I forced myself forward, stepping into the glistening organic passage. The walls convulsed around me, warm and wet, tightening as if sensing my presence. The sound of flesh squelching beneath my boots made my stomach churn. Every instinct in my body screamed to stop, to turn back. But there was no turning back. The pod was on the other side. I ran. The tunnel shuddered. The fleshy walls compressed violently, pushing me forward as if swallowing me whole. I fought against it, forcing my way through. The air grew hotter, heavier, thick with something alive. I gagged as I felt movement beneath my hands, something crawling beneath the surface, shifting and rolling just under the flesh. The tunnel narrowed. I shoved forward, my shoulders scraping against the walls, warm fluids smearing across my arms. I could see the hangar now, the escape pod just beyond the fleshy threshold. One final push. The walls convulsed. A shape lunged at me from the periphery. One of them. No, many. Their bodies merged, shifting together like molten flesh, limbs sprouting and retracting in a grotesque, mindless hunger. Their faces, if they could still be called that, stretched and cried out in a warbling, gargled harmony. I threw myself forward. The tunnel spat me out. I hit the metal grating of the hangar bay hard, skidding across the floor, slick fluids trailing behind me. The escape pod loomed ahead, pristine, untouched by whatever horror had consumed the rest of Hawking 3. I scrambled to my feet. The tunnel behind me collapsed, the walls sucking inward with a sickening wet slurp. The creatures screamed from within as the flesh sealed shut, leaving nothing but a glistening, smooth wall where the passage had been. It wasn't letting them through. I didn't question it. I bolted for the pod, my hands flying over the controls as I dove into the cramped cockpit. The door sealed with a satisfying hiss. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was alone. But I wasn't safe. The entire station began to move. The windows of the pod trembled as Hawking 3 shifted, its structure pulsating like a giant wounded organism. The thing inside it, the thing it was becoming, was no longer passive. It had woken up. A deep, resonant groan echoed through space, a sound I didn't hear with my ears, but felt in my bones. It knew I was escaping. I didn't wait. I slammed the launch sequence. The pod detached just as the station convulsed, a massive section of its hull splitting open like flesh, tearing apart. Something vast and unspeakable shifted within, stretching toward me with tendril-like appendages, gaping with black, unformed mouths. The alien ship loomed in the dark like a wound in space. Its surface was jagged, uneven, neither metallic nor stone. It stretched across the void like something grown, a grotesque amalgamation of fused organic ridges and fossilized plates. The ship's structure was unnatural, too asymmetrical for a machine, too rigid for a living organism. It had no visible thrusters, no windows, no markings. And yet, it was there, waiting. Commander Drake Holloway hovered just beyond the edge of the Astraeus 9's viewport, his breath fogging the glass as he stared at the silent, monstrous construct. "How old do you think it is?" Ivy Lang's voice crackled in his helmet. Drake exhaled. "Impossible to tell. Could be thousands of years, could be millions. Should we go in?" Mikhail Volkov, their engineer, sounded cautious. He had every reason to be. There was no record of anything like this, no transmissions, no signs of a crash, no indication that it had ever moved at all. It was simply there, lurking in the shadow of Phobos, orbiting Mars like a forgotten corpse. But they hadn't come all this way just to turn back. "Suit up," Drake ordered. "We're going in." The docking process was slow and precise. The ship had no visible ports or airlocks, no seams in its outer shell. It was as if the entire structure had sealed itself shut. They coasted carefully along its surface, searching for any opening. Then it opened for them. It happened without warning, without sound, without movement. One moment the surface was solid. The next, it had peeled away in a slow, silent unfurling, a gaping maw of pure darkness yawning open before them. "Jesus," Michael breathed. Did it react to us?" No one answered. Drake's pulse pounded in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, now, to burn their thrusters and put as much distance between them and this thing as possible. Instead, he muttered, "Let's move." They entered single file, their helmet lights cutting through the void. The walls of the corridor, or whatever it was, were ribbed, layers of hardened, ridged material that gleamed dully under their lights. The floor had a texture, like the hardened surface of an ancient exoskeleton. It crunched softly under their boots. The deeper they went, the more the passageway seemed to pulse, like veins embedded within flesh. "This isn't metal," Ivy murmured, running her gloved fingers over the wall. "What is it?" Archer Wren, their lieutenant, asked. His voice was tight, controlled. "Organic. Or it was. I think this ship was once alive." Silence. Something in the stale air made their skin crawl. There was no dust, no debris, no decay. Only stillness, as if the ship had been preserved by the vacuum of space. Then they reached the chamber. It was vast, domed, the walls lined with pods. They were translucent, their exteriors an eerie, milky hue. Some were intact, filled with motionless forms, creatures twisted in death, their shapes alien and unfamiliar, long, spindly limbs curled against themselves, hardened carapaces fused to the walls. Others had been breached, torn apart from the inside. Ivy swallowed hard. "I think these were eggs." Drake turned sharply. "Then where's the host?" Before anyone could answer, one of the pods moved. A slow, pulsing shudder, the membrane rippling like disturbed water. Then from within something stirred. A whisper of movement. A slithering, curling sound, like wet silk peeling away from bone. Archer stepped forward, barely touching the surface of the pod. A hiss escaped from within. A fine, glimmering mist burst into the air around them. And then, the ship woke up. At first, Archer laughed it off. The mist had been nearly invisible, catching the dim glow of their helmet lights for only a second before dispersing in the stale air. Nothing more than dust, he had said, brushing at his suit as though he could wipe it away. But by the time they made it back to the Astraeus 9, the laughter had stopped. Archer had gone pale, sweat beading at his temples, despite the regulated coolness of his suit. He swayed slightly as he stepped into the decontamination chamber, one gloved hand gripping the wall. "You good?" Drake asked, frowning. "Yeah," Archer exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Just lightheaded." They ran the standard decontamination cycle. The ship's sterilization systems blasted them with shortwave UV, chemical misting, and a full-body scan for contaminants. The biofilters detected nothing unusual. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. It started slow, subtle. Archer was quiet during the mission debrief, his usual cocky remarks replaced with vague nods and distracted looks. He barely touched his food during dinner, and when Ivy asked him if he was feeling all right, he only muttered, "Just tired." Then during sleep cycle, he started coughing. Drake woke to the sound of ragged gasps echoing through the dimly lit habitation. He turned toward the sound, heart thudding. Archer sat on the edge of his bunk, hunched over, his hands trembling. He was breathing too fast, too shallow. "Archer," Drake said. Archer didn't look up. He pressed the heel of his palm against his forehead, his shoulders rigid. His veins stood out against his skin, dark, almost black beneath the surface. Drake's stomach twisted. "Ivy," he called, already reaching for the emergency comm panel. The medical bay felt too small as Ivy scanned Archer's vitals. His heart rate was spiking, his blood oxygen dangerously low. The veins around his eyes had darkened, spreading outward like ink bleeding through paper. Archer started, then winced, clutching his side. A thin trickle of black fluid slipped from his nostril. Ivy took a step back. "We need to isolate him." Drake didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand against the emergency override, sealing the med bay doors. Quarantine initiated. Archer looked up, his pupils blown wide, dark pools swallowing the color of his irises. His lips peeled back from his teeth. And then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered, "It's inside me." Ivy stiffened. "What did you say?" Archer shuddered violently. His breath came in short, wet gasps. Then, the first real change happened. His fingernails split. A new layer of something else pushed through, blackened, hard as chitin. His fingers trembled, flexing as if the bones beneath had shifted into something new. Drake reached for a sedative, but Archer lunged, his movement too fast, too unnatural. His body convulsed and something rippled beneath his skin, pressing outward as if something else was trying to emerge. Ivy backed away. Oh, God. Archer's spine arched sharply. His shoulders popped, bones realigning with a sickening crack. His breathing turned shallow, clicking, like something was moving inside his throat. Then, suddenly, he stilled. A long moment of horrible silence passed. Then Archer slowly turned his head toward them. His face was wrong, his skin too tight, the contours of his jaw sharper, elongated. His pupils had vanished entirely, replaced with something glossy and black, something that reflected too much light. And then, in a voice that was both his and something else, he said, "You should have left it alone." The ship had never felt so small before. Drake stood outside the med bay, staring through the reinforced glass, his fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. Inside, Archer was changing. He sat on the edge of the medical cot, his body hunched over, his spine jutting out in sharp ridges along his back. His uniform was soaked through with sweat, but there were dark patches spreading beneath the fabric, something oily, black seeping through. His fingers twitched, longer now, the nails entirely gone, replaced with something else, something hard, segmented. Ivy's hands hovered over the console, running scans, but the data was impossible to read. His vitals were all over the place, his heart rate fluctuating from dangerously slow to a rapid-fire stutter. Oxygen saturation crashed, then stabilized. His body temperature kept rising, but he wasn't burning up. If anything, his skin was hardening, turning a dull, chitinous shade beneath the sweat-slicked surface. "His DNA is changing," Ivy whispered. Her voice was hoarse, like she didn't want to believe the words coming out of her own mouth. Drake exhaled through gritted teeth. "Tell me you can stop it." Ivy swallowed. A sound from inside the medbay made them both go still. A slow, wet crack. Then a deep, inhuman inhale, like lungs expanding for the first time. Drake turned back toward the glass. Archer was standing now, his head tilted forward, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. His fingertips brushed the floor, the joints too long, too stretched. His breathing was shallow, raspy, with a strange clicking sound accompanying every exhale. His face was no longer human. The skin had split along his jawline, revealing something darker beneath. A second layer of flesh, glossy and ridged. His lips had peeled away entirely, exposing sharp, serrated rows of teeth that hadn't been there before. And his eyes. Gone. Just two pools of blackness gleaming in the dim light like polished stone. Mikhail let out a sharp breath beside them. That's not Archer anymore. The thing in the med bay suddenly snapped its head toward the sound. Mikhail froze. The creature's mouth twitched, jaw clicking as if testing its new anatomy. Its chest shuddered, the flesh writhing just beneath the surface. And then, slowly, deliberately, it smiled. Drake moved first. "Lock it down," he barked. Ivy slammed her hand against the containment override, but it was too late. Archer, the thing that had been Archer, moved. Not like a man, not anymore. It lunged, its elongated arms smashing into the reinforced glass, the entire ship shuddering from the impact. Ivy screamed. Mikhail stumbled back, reaching for a weapon he didn't have. Drake barely had time to react before the glass cracked. Hairline fractures spread outward from the impact point, a spiderweb of tiny lines racing toward the edges. The thing tilted its head, watching them. Then it pressed its forehead against the glass and whispered in a voice that barely sounded human anymore. More. The glass gave way. The creature exploded forward, moving faster than anything should in the ship's controlled gravity. Drake barely managed to dodge as it lashed out, its newly formed limbs too many joints, too many angles. Mikhail wasn't so lucky. It hit him first, claws punching through his chest, his body jerking violently. Blood, too much blood, sprayed across the walls, floating in weightless beads in the low-gravity environment. Mikhail let out a wet, choking sound. His hands twitched. His body shuddered in the thing's grip. Then the creature tore him in half. Ivy's scream echoed through the ship, raw and broken. Drake grabbed her wrist and ran. Behind them, the thing that had been Archer dropped Mikhail's remains, the wet sound of flesh hitting metal reverberating through the corridor. It didn't chase immediately. Instead, it turned toward the nearest ventilation shaft, its new limbs skittering, pulling its body in unnatural directions. Then, with impossible speed, it vanished into the ship. Drake's breath came in ragged bursts. Ivy collapsed against the corridor wall, her hands shaking, her face streaked with Mikhail's blood. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, wild. "Drake," she whispered, "it's not done changing." He closed his eyes, the horror settling deep in his bones. "I know." The Astraeus 9 was dying. Red emergency lights pulsed in the corridors, casting jagged shadows over the walls. The ship groaned beneath them, metal straining, air pressure fluctuating as the oxygen levels plummeted. The filtration system was compromised. The spores were everywhere now, invisible, crawling into their lungs with every breath. Drake's vision blurred at the edges. His limbs felt heavy, a fever burning deep beneath his skin. He wasn't infected, yet, but the ship was against him now. It was only a matter of time. Ivy coughed, blood flecking her lips as she leaned against the command console, her breath ragged. It's still in the vents. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's growing." Drake already knew. He could feel it. The ship's walls seemed thicker, the air denser, like the alien thing was spreading through the vessel itself, turning Astraeus 9 into a hive. The creature, Archer, or what was left of him, was somewhere above them, skittering through the air ducts, watching. It wasn't hiding anymore. It was waiting. Drake gritted his teeth. His hands were slick with blood. Some of it his, some of it from Michael. Michael, who had died screaming. They couldn't let this thing get to Earth. He turned to the console. "Help me input the override," he said. His voice was hoarse, final. Ivy hesitated. "Drake, there's no way out." He swallowed hard. "We blow the ship." Her hands trembled. She pressed them against the console, her breathing shaky, shallow. She knew he was right. There was no cure, no hope. If even a single spore made it back home, the infection would spread, change, consume. Humanity wouldn't stand a chance. Ivy reached for the manual override, her fingers slick with sweat. Together, they initiated the self-destruct sequence. 10 minutes. The countdown blinked on the display, the ship groaning as the emergency core overload engaged. Drake exhaled. "It's done." A sound echoed through the corridors, a wet, skittering scrape. Ivy went still. It was here. A slow, inhuman chittering vibrated through the metal, deep and alien, a sound that didn't belong to the human throat, but something birthed in darkness. The air vent above them buckled. Then, with terrifying speed, the creature dropped down. It was fully transformed now. Its body had elongated, distorted, human proportions stretched beyond recognition. Its limbs were twisted, its skin hardened into something chitinous and black, pulsing with vein-like ridges that moved beneath the surface. The face was the worst. It still resembled Archer, but only in the way that a skull resembles a living person. The skin had peeled back, exposing layers of hard tissue, the teeth jagged and serrated, a secondary jaw twitching beneath the first. And the eyes, they were too deep, too black, reflecting light where there should be none. Ivy choked on a sob, pressing herself against the wall. The creature tilted its head. It studied them. Then it smiled. Drake fired first. The shotgun blast ripped through its shoulder, black fluid spraying across the command module. The creature shrieked, a sound that rattled in his skull, vibrating through his bones. It lunged. Drake barely had time to push Ivy out of the way before claws slashed across his chest, cutting through fabric and skin. Pain bloomed, sharp, deep. Ivy screamed his name. Drake hit the floor hard, his vision flashing white. His chest burned, warmth soaking through his suit, his pulse hammering in his ears. He blinked up. The creature was on top of him now, its jaws hinging open, the second row of teeth slithering forward. Ivy grabbed a fire extinguisher and swung it. Crack! The blow hit its temple, the force sending it stumbling back with a shriek. Drake gasped, rolling onto his side, blood pooling beneath him. Ivy grabbed his arm, trying to pull him up, but his legs barely obeyed. His chest felt wrong, his vision blurring at the edges. The creature shook its head, its body twitching, the wound already beginning to mend itself. It wouldn't stay down. Drake looked at the console. The countdown was still ticking. 5 minutes. They wouldn't make it to the escape pod. Ivy knew it too. Her face was pale, streaked with blood and sweat, her lips pressed into a trembling line. She could still run. There was one pod left. Drake grabbed her wrist. Go. She froze. No, she whispered. Not without you. The creature moved again, its limbs cracking as it recovered, resetting itself, eyes locked onto them once more. Drake's grip tightened. You have to go. His voice was urgent, raw with something close to desperation. Ivy shook her head, tears welling in her bloodshot eyes. I can't. Drake grabbed the emergency release for the airlock. His hand hovered over it. There was only one way to stop it from escaping. His fingers curled around the lever. Drake, Ivy breathed. He pulled it. The airlock burst open, decompression screaming through the module as everything ripped toward the void. The creature shrieked, claws scrambling for purchase, its body twisting violently as it was sucked into space. And Ivy was going with it. She clung to the console, her fingers white-knuckled, her eyes wild with terror as the vacuum dragged her. Drake lunged forward, his good arm locking around her waist, his body bracing against the force. She screamed, clawing at him as the pressure threatened to rip them apart. Her eyes met his, and in that split second, she understood. He wasn't letting go. She was. Her grip slipped, and then she was gone, sucked into the blackness of space, her body spiraling out, arms outstretched, her lips forming his name. And then she was just a silhouette against the stars. Drake didn't remember hitting the floor. Didn't remember the last seconds of the countdown, or the moment the core finally detonated, a white-hot blast of fire and light consuming the ship. The last thing he remembered was the thing in the dark, drifting, reaching, waiting. And then, nothing. It started with Henderson. She was one of the best among us. Steady hands, sharp mind, the kind of person you trusted with your life in the cold black. She worked the engineering deck, kept the Odyssey alive when the rest of us were barely holding it together. The mission had been going for 400 years, passed down through generations of crew. We were born into this life, our purpose written in the ship's logs long before we took our first breath. Reach Erebus 3. Establish the first human colony beyond the solar system. Simple, clear, a future we all believed in. But then Henderson changed. At first it was little things. She got quiet. Not just the kind of quiet that comes from exhaustion, but the unnerving kind, like something was pulling her thoughts in directions the rest of us couldn't see. She stopped sitting with us in the mess, stopped answering her comms right away. Then she started whispering. I walked in on her once down in maintenance. She was hunched over an open vent, speaking in a low murmur. The air recyclers hissed behind her, masking most of what she said, but I caught fragments. It knows my name. It's watching. Henderson. She flinched, spun around too fast, knocking a wrench off the console. Her eyes were dark, sleepless. Jesus, you scared me, she exhaled. I called your name 3 times. She looked past me toward the vent, then forced a shaky smile. Sorry, just tired. I let it go. We all got tired. Then the screaming started. I woke in the middle of the night cycle to a raw, inhuman sound echoing through the ship. A noise so sharp, so unnatural, it made my skin crawl. By the time I reached the airlock, Reyes was already there, trying to pry Henderson's hands off the inner hatch. Blood smeared the metal where her nails had splintered, torn down to raw flesh. She was trying to open the door. She wasn't in a suit. We tackled her to the deck, pinned her thrashing limbs until she stopped fighting. She was sobbing, her breath ragged, her eyes darting frantically across the ceiling like she was seeing something we couldn't. It's in the vents, she gasped. I can hear it whispering. It knows we're here. I glanced at Reyes. She shook her head. There's nothing there, Henderson, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You're exhausted. You need to. Henderson grabbed my wrist. Her fingers burned against my skin. The mission isn't real, she whispered. They're watching us. Then she went still. We carried her to the infirmary, strapped her to the medbed for her own safety. She didn't fight us. She just lay there, staring at the ceiling, mumbling under her breath. I stood at the doorway, listening. She wasn't speaking English anymore. She wasn't speaking anything I recognized. 3 days after we locked Henderson in the infirmary, the messages arrived. I barely slept in those 3 days. None of us did. Henderson had stopped speaking, stopped moving. She just lay there, eyes unfocused, lips occasionally twitching as if she were whispering to something. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. The med scanners showed nothing wrong with her physically, but something had hollowed her out. Reyes was the one who found the first message. She was running a routine diagnostics check on the comm system when her screen flickered, Text scrolling across it in sharp, clinical lines. Subject 0123 exhibits signs of dissociative instability, increase environmental stressors. She thought it was an error at first, a corrupted log, but the timestamp was decades old, over 70 years. No transmission had been running that long. Then another message appeared. Subject 0456 remains unaware of external stimuli. Proceed with next phase. It didn't have a sender. No encryption, just words appearing where they shouldn't. Reyes called me down to comms, her face pale, sweat beading on her brow. "I didn't pull this," she said, her voice tight. "It just showed up." I stared at the text. My stomach turned. "We need to check the ship's logs," I said. It took us hours to comb through the files. Most of the data was routine. Navigation, life support, engineering reports. But buried deep in the system, behind layers of outdated encryption, we found them. Hundreds of messages, all of them following the same pattern. Cold, detached, observational. Subject 0032, experiencing elevated paranoia. Further isolation required. Subject 0145, beginning to question mission parameters. Monitor closely. Subject 0098, unresponsive. Initiate retrieval protocol. The timestamps spanned centuries, since the beginning. Someone had been watching us. The messages weren't instructions, they were reports. I felt the weight of the ship around me suddenly, its metal walls, its endless corridors. The hum of the air recyclers became deafening. "Who the hell is sending these?" Reyes whispered. The answer sat heavy in my throat. Earth. We were an experiment. The truth started unraveling fast. Sections of the ship we knew had been there before. Hallways, storage rooms, were gone, replaced by solid bulkheads. The supply records didn't match our actual rations. There was food that shouldn't exist, and missing items that had never been used. Reality itself was breaking apart. Then the smell started. Faint at first, just a damp organic musk hanging in the air vents. But it grew. Thick. Rotting. Something like spoiled fruit left too long in the heat. And then Henderson disappeared. I went to check on her the following night. The infirmary door was still locked. The security feeds showed her strapped to the bed, unmoving. Then, at 0300 hours, the feed glitched, only for 3 seconds. When the screen came back online, the bed was empty. The restraints were torn open. Blood smeared across the floor, trailing toward the vent. A vent too small for anyone to fit through. Reyes found something half buried under the bed frame. A human tooth. I turned back to the open vent, the darkness yawning beyond it. Somewhere inside the ship, something moved. It hunted at night. We didn't see it at first. We only heard it, scraping, a slow, wet slither echoing through the ventilation shafts. It moved in bursts, fast when we weren't looking, impossibly silent when we were. The ship's metal groaned as if it were breathing. We sealed the infirmary. Not that it mattered anymore. Henderson was gone. We triple-checked the logs, but the cameras didn't show anything. One moment she was there, the next she wasn't. "People don't just vanish," Reyes muttered. I didn't answer, because something deep in my gut told me that whatever took Henderson wasn't a person. Then Reyes got sick. At first, it was small things. She looked gray, her skin slick with sweat, her hands shaking when she reached for a cup of water. She kept rolling her shoulders, rubbing the back of her neck like something was burrowing under her skin. Then the lesions appeared. Long, dark slits opened along her ribs, the skin peeling back like old fabric. They weren't cuts, they were growing. "What the hell is happening to me?" she whispered, standing in front of the medbay mirror. I didn't know what to say, because I could see something shifting underneath. The slits in her flesh pulsed, the tissue splitting further apart. The deeper the wounds got, the more I saw something moving inside her. I grabbed her arm. "We need to quarantine you." She yanked away. Her breath hitched, her pupils blown wide. "You don't get it," she rasped. "It's not just me." Her fingers trembled as she reached under her shirt, pressing against the skin just beneath her ribs. I saw it then. A shape. A wriggling, translucent shape, pressing from beneath, stretching her skin like a membrane. Reyes exhaled sharply, her legs giving out. I barely caught her before she hit the floor. "The air!" she gasped. "We've been breathing it in." My stomach twisted. Henderson was never sick. She just heard it first. Reyes was changing. I tried to get her to the infirmary, but she refused. She fought me like an animal backed into a corner. "You think I don't know what happens next?" she whispered, her voice hollow. She was right. We had all seen what happened to Henderson. So that night I stayed up, sitting outside Reyes's quarters. My pulse pounded in my ears. The ship was too quiet. The vents no longer groaned. The slithering had stopped, as if it was waiting. At 0322 hours, the alarms screamed. I burst into Reyes's room and found her standing in the middle of the floor. Blood soaked her uniform. Her fingers were buried inside herself, digging into the open wounds along her stomach. Her breath was shallow. Her hands trembled as she pulled. And something came out. A wet, glistening thing, milky and pulsating, its tendrils twitching as it unfurled from her body. Its limbs were thin, almost skeletal, but they moved with a horrifying purpose, curling around Reyes's trembling fingers. "I can hear them," she whispered. "They've been waiting." Then her body convulsed, her knees buckling. I lunged forward, but before I could reach her, the thing scuttled away, disappearing into the vents. The slithering sound returned, only this time it wasn't one. It was many. I am the last one. The ship is empty now. The corridors stretch on forever, silent but not still. I can feel it breathing around me, the walls pulsing with something damp and living beneath the metal. The others are gone. Reyes was the last to go after she ripped herself apart. I don't know if she died or if she simply changed. Whatever came out of her, whatever crawled away, it was alive. And I think it's still here. I haven't slept in days. The smell of rot is everywhere now, thick and cloying. It seeps into my skin, clings to my lungs. The ship is cold, the lights flickering more often than not. The air recyclers run on a loop, humming with static. Then, today, the final message arrived. It appeared on every screen, scrolling across the monitors in jagged, ancient text. Subject 0001 is the last remaining test participant. Psychological endurance nearing critical failure. Begin termination sequence. The lights died. The doors locked. The temperature plummeted. Then I heard them. Not from the vents this time. Not from the walls. From inside me. A wet, slithering sound coiling through my ribs, pressing against my spine. I staggered backward, gripping my chest, retching. My skin felt tight, stretched over something that wasn't just me anymore. I looked down. Beneath my uniform, just under my ribs, my skin bulged. Something moved beneath it. Breathing. I stumbled toward the main console, clawing at the interface, desperate to send anything back to Earth, to whoever had done this to us. The ship wasn't a vessel. It was an incubator. A farm. They had been breeding something inside us for centuries, feeding it, watching it grow. My fingers hovered over the emergency transmission key. Then I saw it. The camera feed. It was still broadcasting. The entire time someone had been watching. A control room, cold and sterile, somewhere back on Earth. Or whatever was left of Earth. Figures stood in the shadows, their faces just out of focus. Scientists, observers, or something else. I opened my mouth to scream, but then my stomach convulsed. Something sharp pushed up through my throat. I choked, gagging, my vision darkening. I hit the floor, my limbs locking as something forced its way up my esophagus. And then I saw it. A single translucent limb unfurling from my mouth, twitching in the stale air. Not human. Not anymore. The screen in front of me flickered. The last words I would ever see. Test complete.